Greetings! You are clearly here because you have been blessed with the opportunity to take Language A, which means you have to prepare for Paper 2, one of the IB's most comprehensive language exams. I think that's awesome, and I'm glad you're here. If you weren't here, I'd be talking to myself, and that'd be weird. In this class, we're going to explore how to ace this test. This is not a lecture, it's a guide. And I'm here to keep it real with you by telling you the tricks and the expectations to meet when you're taking this exam.
We're also going to discuss some of the biggest mistakes students make so that you can hopefully avoid those.
A lot of times, students have the right idea, but sometimes they lack the proper guidance of how to put it all together or how to deliver it effectively. But worry not, we're going to make sure you do that just fine. So, without further ado, let's get started by discussing what exactly this exam entails.
Let's clarify what this exam is going to look like. The student taking the test will be given a paper with 4 different prompts on it. These prompts are essentially the questions or the topics that the student needs to write about. The student gets to choose which one they wish to answer. Easy enough, right? But the prompts can be quite challenging for many students. Some students get overwhelmed with these prompts, especially when they don't have a lot of practice with literary analysis, because these sorts of questions can be quite verbose, and unnecessarily so, to be honest. They're using a lot of words. Some students have trouble figuring out what exactly they're asking for. The IB Paper 2 is like a nightclub. We all know we're here to dance, and we're all prepared to get down. I'm talking about down with the sound, baby. But we gotta know what kind of dance moves the IB's looking for. So we gotta figure it out so that we know what moves to pop off on the dance floor. And when I say what moves to pop out on the dance floor, I mean what to write about in our essay, just in case that wasn't clear. Some IB prompts are super simple to understand, but others can be a bit more complicated, especially when they're accompanied by a qualifier. In other words, an additional sentence that adds context. Although the qualifier is supposed to make the prompt clearer, sometimes it actually confuses students even more. So if you're given a prompt with a qualifier and you find it confusing, simple. Apply the Starbucks method. The Starbucks method, you may say. Oh yes. Think about it.
When you go into a Starbucks, you'll see that they speak their own nonsense language. Grande matcha latte. The hell does that mean? It's gibberish. They speak their own pidgin language. It's disturbing. But when you break it down into simplicity, it basically means a large green tea with milk. See? It gets a lot simpler when you break it down.
So, the Starbucks method can be applied to the IB prompts as well. First, jump past the qualifier and look directly at the prompt or the assignment itself. No need to get bombarded with unnecessary words. Our goal is to understand what our objective is. That's the very first thing we need to do on this exam. And often, to understand what your assignment is, you don't always need to understand the qualifier. So if you find the qualifier too confusing, pass by it for now and look directly at what the actual assignment is. Then another thing you can do if you have a wordy prompt or a wordy qualifier is try to remove redundancy. And how do you do that, you may ask? Well, first, if you see a lot of adjectives, cross off any that you don't need. Like in this example, the memorable impact of novels and short stories arises from the careful and often brilliant creation of detail by their writers. Using at least 2 writers that you've studied, explore the role and the impact of some significant details in the narratives. Okay, well, first off, if something has an impact on you, we could venture to say it's memorable. And that's kind of what it means to be impactful. If something impacts you, it influences you, and it tends to stick with you. So we can combine those terms and just get rid of the word memorable. We can also take out careful and brilliant because it has nothing to do with what we're being asked. This is essentially the IB's opinion, and they're complementing the art form of writing. But these are words that we do not need in order to understand the prompt. They don't do anything for us. For example, imagine you and I were at a party, and I introduce you to someone by saying, "Oh, this is my friend, Fat John." Well, alright, do you need the word fat there? No, because all you need to know is that John is my friend. Throwing in fat is insulting, first off, and completely unnecessary. So, the same for these adjectives the IB is throwing into the prompt. Sorry IB, we all appreciate the blah 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 blah, but we don't need it right now. Next, if you see any other terms that can be combined, combine them, like in this example. Narratives and short stories. Okay, so we could just call those stories or texts. We don't need all those additional words, we could summarize it with one word, just to keep it simple. So now we've broken down that longer prompt into this. The impact of stories arises from the creation of detail by their writers. One last thing you can do to simplify ideas is to turn passive voice into active voice. You do that by putting the subject before the verb. So let's go back to our previous example. We can turn the creation of detail by their writers into the sentence, the writer's creation of detail. And we can turn the impact of stories into the story's impact. Reading in active voice tends to be easier for people to comprehend. So now, our final version of this prompt says, the story's impact arises from the writer's creation of detail. Now that's a lot easier to understand. And if you want, you can even apply the same thing to the actual assignment statement. Down here where it says the role and impact of some significant details in the narratives, we could switch that around, put it into active voice so that it says explore some significant details, role, and impact in the narratives. And if you want to take it a step further, you could probably also eliminate some significant, because obviously, if the details have an impact on the story, they must be pretty significant. Now, of course, you do not need to do any of this, but if you do find yourself getting confused by the prompt, or if the prompt is a little bit too wordy for you, these are some methods you can apply that might make the prompt a bit simpler to understand. Now, be very careful. One of the biggest mistakes students make is that they don't read the question carefully. It is very easy to misread or assume what they want you to do if you don't read carefully. Let me give you an example. Let's take this question. To what extent could the two works you studied be considered a work of protest? That is not asking how is protest depicted in the novel. It's not asking us to talk about protest in the stories. It's asking us how the story itself is an example of protest. So that means we have to know the cultural implications of the story and the time period in which it was written. In other words, we have to know what was going on at the time this book was written so that we understand what the author was trying to protest. And then, once we understand that, and we understand what's happening in the book, we have to make a connection. Like, how is what's happening in the book going against what was happening in society at that time? All right, what were the commonly held beliefs back then about the topics discussed in the book? And how does the story go against those commonly held beliefs?
So be careful about nuanced differences there. Always look at what they are asking you to do. And if you are unsure, even after you've unpacked it and analyzed it, again, consider choosing another prompt. Because if you answer a question that they're not asking, even if you do a great job of answering it, your score will be low simply for being off topic. So know your question. Know your prompt, playa. IB likes to ask simple questions in complicated ways. Of course, they're nerds. They love that stuff.
So, the very first thing you need to do on this exam is understand your question. And when you understand the question and you know exactly what you're supposed to write about, then you're ready to start preparing your answer. As we've established, the IB loves using big words, especially in its prompts. So, there are a few words or phrases that you might encounter when reading some Paper 2 prompts. So we're going to cover what they mean just so you have a good idea of what exactly they're asking you if you happen to encounter them. First off, if you see the word significance, what is the significance of something? It's just a fancy way of asking what is the purpose or what is the importance? What is its meaning? What is the value of it within the story? Basically, you have to answer the question, so what? Why is this here? Why do we need it? The term to what extent is a measurement. It's asking you to evaluate how something was done, how much of it was done, and how effective it was. The word portrayal is a fancy way to refer to how something is presented. In other words, how is something shown? If you see the term the role, like what is the role of something, that's just asking how and why is it used. In other words, what is its purpose? If you see the term microcosm is basically a small representation of something bigger. So, for example, they may ask how the novel is a microcosm of the larger world. And what they mean by that is how is the stuff in the story like a miniature version of the human experience? And finally, an allegory. An allegory is a story that has a larger meaning. Typically, it's trying to teach a lesson or expand a message of some sort. Often, it's trying to make a social, political, or cultural statement. The novel Animal Farm is a perfect example of an allegory, because although it's about a bunch of animals on a farm, it's not really about a bunch of animals on a farm. The author's true intention was to explore the dangers of politics and hopefully teach his readers something along the way.
So step one is to make sure you understand the question. And you might say, Well, what do I do if I don't understand the question? Try to break it down. And if you try to break it down and you're still confused, I'll tell you exactly what to do. Do not choose that question. Don't pick that prompt. If you go to a restaurant, do you order the thing that you don't know? Right? You see something called the flobbity-dobbity-dop-dop. Are you going to order that? No. At least not without asking the waiter what it is. I mean, sure, maybe if you're feeling adventurous, but don't feel adventurous on this exam. Additionally, do not choose a prompt that you kinda understand. Do not choose a prompt that you only understand partially. The reason for that is simple. You need to make sure you address all aspects of the prompt. You have to answer the question completely. If you don't, it doesn't matter how well written or brilliant your answer is, it will perform low on the rubric because it will be considered only partially answered. That's not good. You're given multiple options. Make sure you fully understand the question you pick. Because if you don't, there's a good chance you won't give a comprehensive enough answer to get top scores. But you know this already, right? Of course. You're given 4 questions to choose from. Pick the easiest one for you to answer. Duh. Now that we understand the question, let's get down to how to actually formulate our response. In other words, how do you answer these Mother 11 questions? Which brings me to another giant mistake students make, which is summarizing but not analyzing.
There is a huge difference between analysis and summary, and this is one of the biggest reasons students underperform on this exam. They get way too caught up in summary without enough analysis. So what's the difference? Summarizing is telling your reader what happened. Analyzing is explaining the purpose or the meaning of what happened. So focus on analysis, not summary. In other words, explain, don't tell.
When you analyze, you're like Sherlock Holmes, only instead of looking for Jack the Ripper, you're looking for significance and understanding within the text. In other words, you're looking deep into the book, understanding it as more than just a story. You're looking for evidence to support your opinion. It becomes a tool. To make a comparison, imagine you love a sport. Any sport you like, football, baseball, wrestling, whatever. Now let's imagine that you know that sport very, very well. Better than most. Well, if we both sit down to watch that sport, let's say football, for example, we are going to see the same thing, but you are going to understand it much more than I do. Right? I may look at them on the field and say, oh, hey, they're pretty good. But you can look at their stats and their plays and explain why they're good. You can discuss in what ways they're good, what their stats mean in comparison to others, and why they stand out. That is analysis, and it's exactly what you got to do on the IB test.
You analyze these stories and the authors of these stories and the cultural context of these stories and try to understand how it all connects to your prompt on a deep level. Now here's the thing. When it comes to literature and the arts in general, music, films, etc., you can essentially argue anything. But whether people take you seriously or not depends on whether or not you have good reasons. Does your evidence make sense? Is it interesting and compelling enough to validate your idea? Or are people going to take it as silly or weak? So remember, when you make a claim, whether it's on this test or anywhere else, you should back it up with some sort of proof. If you're going to say that Harry Potter was jealous of Hermione, okay, cool, make that argument, but you need to support that with some sort of realistic evidence from the story. Otherwise, people are just going to roll their eyes and assume you don't know what you're talking about.
Bro, what are you talking about, man?
Let me make an analogy. If I accuse someone of eating my ice cream, I need proof. I can't just go around and blame every Tom, Dick, and Cletus for eating my ice cream without evidence. I need some sort of proof, right? He had chocolate on his lips. I saw the stick sticking out of his pocket. I saw the wrapper hidden in his sock. Okay, cool. That at least shows that I have some validation for my claim. Same with the IB exam. You can't just say stuff about the book. You need proof. You can't just say the author uses characterization to show a character's jealousy. You need the evidence, because that is the analysis.
So let's look at an example of summary versus analysis. What do they both look like so that we know how to tell the difference?
Let's take a look at an example.
I walked into my house one late afternoon, surprised to see that my front door was unlocked. I stepped into the living room as a cool chill of air flooded from the fan and brushed upon me. Suddenly, I saw the puddle of a sticky, dark red substance all over the floor, trailing into the kitchen. The TV was on. It was a news report. The anchor was informing viewers that the Manchester murderer, an infamous serial killer, had escaped from the local prison. My heart began to beat like a snare drum. "Dad?" I asked aloud. Questions flooded my mind. Why was the door open? Where was everyone? What was the dark red trail? And what was at the end of it? Okay, so let's say this is the text you're analyzing, and let's say the IB gives you this prompt. How does the author's stylistic choices help develop the story? What is that asking? That's basically asking what devices, metaphor, simile, whatever, is the author using, and how does the use of it help the author tell the story? How does it help him express his main ideas? How does it help him express his overall message? How does it help the readers care about the characters? Whatever. You could talk about all that stuff. Because the prompt is essentially just asking about what tools the author uses to create the story. So let's take a look at this, and I want you to decide whether you consider this a summary or an analysis.
It's time to play summary or analysis.
Is it a summary or an analysis? I can't even tell. I'm such a dork.
The author uses many stylistic choices to develop the story. First, the author uses characterization by showing how shocked the character is. The protagonist returns home surprised to see his door is unlocked. Then, he finds a mysterious puddle of red fluid on the floor with a news report warning residents of a homicidal prisoner who'd recently escaped from a nearby prison. He began looking for his father, wondering to himself why he has found the house in its current condition. All of this helps the audience understand that the character is surprised and confused. Now, in your opinion, is that primarily a summary or an analysis?
Say what? Break it down now.
If you said summary, I would agree with you. This example is more summary than analysis. They do have a line or two in there that sounds analytical, but it's not really developed, and the majority of the sentences in there are simply recounting what happened in the story. So now, let's look at a more analytical response. In order to hook the audience's attention, the author immediately begins his story with intrigue, which he establishes by creating a setting that conflicts with the protagonist's expectations. Upon arrival, the character finds an unlocked door and a mysterious puddle of red liquid. The description suggests, but does not confirm, that this substance is blood, which when paired with a strangely unlocked door creates unease because the author's reaction illustrated that these details are out of the ordinary. The author builds upon this initial intrigue with suspense, which he develops through first-person narration. Because the protagonist is also the narrator, we are privy to his fear and confusion. The author applied basic imagery to demonstrate the character's discomfort when he states that the character's heart beat like a snare drum. This simile conjures up thoughts of a loud, heavy, pounding thump that clearly captures the protagonist's increasing terror. The author also includes a detail about an escaped killer. This is being reported on a newscast, which at first seems like it is being used to foreshadow pending danger. However, by the end of the story, we realize that it is simply being used as a red herring to create fear within the audience by making them think that there may be a killer within the midst of the story. The author continues to build upon the audience's fear by using rhetorical questions to demonstrate the character's bewilderment and concern, all of which contributes to building a tense, intimidating mood.
So you can see,
I just got 3 short paragraphs of analysis
from one simple short story excerpt. Why? Because I'm looking at what the author is trying to do, what tools the author is using. What does the author want the audience to experience? I'm looking at the how and the why, not the what. So, just to make sure you remember that, because it's very important, we have put together a music video to help you remember to analyze, not summarize. I mean, this is amazing. I haven't seen it yet, but it sounds awesome. Let's play it.
You gotta analyze, not summarize. You gotta analyze, not summarize. Whoa, whoa.
What? Really? Let's just go to the next section. Allow me to emphasize something. When it comes to books you read for the IB, they all have an underlying message. And even if they don't, it doesn't matter because we have to pretend that they do. That is what literature is. Do all stories have an underlying message? That's debatable. But I guarantee you the books that you've read for IB all have one. Or at least your teachers and the IB think they do. So know what it is. What is the author trying to say with this story? About life, about relationships, about society, about the human experience. Part of analysis is identifying what this underlying message is. Now, with that said, let's discuss how to analyze. When you analyze a text, there are a few different aspects you can focus on, which we can easily remember with the acronym CATS. Meow. That's right, I said it. Meow. Isn't that what a cat does? Yeah. Well, this is a cat. It's a different kind of cat, but still, it's a cat all the same. Meow.
CATS stands for content, audience and purpose, tone and mood, and style and structure. So let's go into detail on what exactly those categories entail. In other words, what do they all mean? Let's start with content. Content refers to the characters, the conflicts, the setting, the theme, the plot line, everything that happens in the story itself. What are the big ideas within the story? Who's the protagonist? Who's the antagonist? What's the issue between them? Why is that issue between them? How does the dialogue help tell the story? When it comes to analyzing content, you are looking closely at what happens in the story and trying to figure out why it's significant. Next, we have audience and purpose. This refers to what the overall point of the story is, as in, why was it written? What is the author's intention? In other words, what is the author trying to say with the story and who is the author trying to say it to? Every author writes a story for a reason.
Now to clarify, when I say what is the purpose of writing, your initial reaction may be to make money, duh. Yes, you and I know this, but in the world of literary analysis, that's not the reason. Great-grandma IB is a dork, and she doesn't think about writing as a job. She thinks about writing as a means of communication, and that's it. These books all have something to say, and we have to be the ones to figure out what it is. So, as far as we are concerned, the authors did not write these stories for money. They wrote them because they have a message hidden inside, like some note in a bottle floating in the ocean, and we have to decipher what it is. Great-grandma IB's a dweeb. What do you want from me?
There are usually three purposes when it comes to communication: to inform, to persuade, or to entertain. Most novels are intended to entertain, at least to some degree, right? That's what stories do. But they're usually also looking to inform or persuade the audience. They may be criticizing something about society. They may be emphasizing an observation about human behavior. They usually have a message of some sort, and the authors are using their story to make that point. So, when you want to figure out what that point is, some questions to ask include: when and where was this text written, and what was happening culturally, socially, and politically in that place at that time? Is the author trying to suggest something about that time period? Or perhaps the author is trying to suggest something about life itself, something that applies to all cultures and all time periods. Either way, what is the author trying to say about the world? Is the author celebrating something? Is the author criticizing something? Is the author trying to point out something that other people don't realize? Or maybe something that people don't talk enough about? All novels chosen for IB have some sort of underlying purpose, so figure out what it is, and if you can't figure out what it is, and your teachers don't know what it is, then just Google it. The answer is out there, and it's not going to be hard to find. I promise.
These are what you're going to use to answer your question, to address your prompt, whatever it may be. Essentially, this is your artillery. You'll have all this knowledge stored up in the old mental shed, and depending on the question you're asked, the prompt you're given, you will know which weapons you need to use. You know what I mean?
The next aspect of analysis is tone and mood. So first, let's clarify the difference between these two terms. Tone refers to how the author feels about what they're writing about. In other words, what is the author's attitude about it all? How are they feeling? It's all about their point of view or their opinion on things. For example, their tone might be sarcastic or cynical or nostalgic or lighthearted. You can usually identify tone based upon what words the author chooses to use, the context of the things that are said, and even things like punctuation. For example, if you come up to me and you say, "Hey, are you going to waste your time watching that senseless Barbie movie?" Your word choice alone reveals how you feel about that movie. Clearly, you disapprove. Right? You're making it clear that you are not about being a Barbie girl in a Barbie world, because you're speaking with a critical tone. Maybe it's not pink enough for you. I don't know what your problem is, but your tone suggests you're not a fan. Right? Waste your time, senseless. These word choices reveal that to me without you even saying anything else. So tone reveals how the author feels about what they're talking about. Mood, on the other hand, reveals how the audience is supposed to feel. It's the atmosphere of the story. Easiest example of this is the horror genre. Horror stories typically try to create a dreary, spooky, lonely, gloomy, frightening mood. That's the job, right? That's the purpose of horror. It's supposed to be scary. So, horror authors are going to try to create a mood that makes readers feel uneasy and fearful. Now, this can also be established through word choice, but in addition to that, through setting, through dialogue, through literary techniques. I mean, you're essentially thinking in terms of feelings and emotions. What is the reader supposed to feel? And what tools is the author using to create that feeling? When you're analyzing tone and mood, it's not enough to simply identify it. You also have to think about why the author's creating that mood or using that tone. Think about how mood affects a story. Think about what the author's tone suggests about his or her message. How does it help the author convey how they feel about the topic? How do mood and or tone impact the author's message? How does it help the author tell the story? Finally, we have the style and structure of a text. Style refers to the tools and the techniques the author uses to tell the story. The decisions that the author makes that make him or her unique. For example, Dr. Seuss and Stephen King could both write a story about living in a small town, but the way they tell that story is going to be starkly different because they have different styles. They use different techniques, and they tell their stories in different ways. Style refers to the literary techniques and devices the author uses in the story. Metaphor, simile, hyperbole, characterization, conflict, that kind of stuff. And structure refers to the genre, the type of text, the chronology of events, the organization, how it's all compiled. Here, we are looking at the tools and techniques an author uses to convey the message. For example, if the author thought to themselves, "Oh, I know, I want to write a story that conveys a message that power corrupts innocence," then you have to look at how the writing techniques, the style or the structure, helps that author tell that story. This is the way you have to think when you are trying to analyze the style or structure of a text. Why did the author use this approach or this technique to convey his or her message? What impact do they have? No different than analyzing a sports game, right? Why did the football team choose to run the ball rather than pass it? Or why did the MMA fighter go for a takedown rather than a strike? Or why did this musician use an electric guitar and not an acoustic guitar? You're looking closely at the tools and the choices the author has made and trying to figure out why they did it, what impact those choices had, and how it helped them convey their overall message and craft their story. Now, if you are the type of student who is maybe not a huge fan of literature, you may ask yourself a very valid question, right? When someone says, "Hey, you have to figure out why an author used metaphor, or why they chose first person narration, or why they're focusing on this theme, or why they're using that description." When you're told you have to figure that out just to get a good grade on the IB exam, the question you might ask yourself is, how the funk should I know? And that's a valid question. I feel your pain.
Valid question.
The truth is, we don't necessarily know what the author's intentions are, because usually we can't ask them. But keep in mind that all art is open to interpretation. By definition, you may experience art differently than I. Music, paintings, films, and novels can all have different interpretations. That means there is no wrong answer. There are just poorly explained and poorly defended answers. For example, Animal Farm is about the dangers of political power. This is the most commonly accepted interpretation of that story. But maybe you want to argue that Animal Farm is about love and how love can be used to control people. Okay, that's not the common interpretation of that novel, but it doesn't mean you're wrong. It does mean, though, that you need to have a tight, well-structured argument that proves that your interpretation holds up. Thus, as a student taking the IB test, you have two options. Either learn what the most commonly accepted interpretation is, in other words, the reason that your teacher tells you, or the reasons that SparkNotes identifies, and use their analysis, because they will likely give you the most widely recognized and most generally accepted interpretation of the story. And if you learn that, then you don't need to learn analysis as much as you simply have to memorize someone else's analysis. Or two, you have to figure out your own analysis, but make sure it is well developed, well supported, and as foolproof as possibly can be. Now, a lot of people understand how to discuss the impact of stylistic techniques, right? Why did an author use metaphor, for example, and how that helps prove the message? But a lot of people can get confused talking about structure. How do you discuss the impact of structure on a book's overall message? So let me give a quick example. Let's say you have two texts, both of which talk about the economy. Woo! Economy talk. Yay, we all love that. So let's say one is an article and one is a poem. Gotta love those economic poems. So now you have to figure out, why did the authors choose those forms to express their ideas, right? What effect does it have on the audience? How does each help convey the message? So if you think about it, a news article might be used because it's seen as educational. It's supposed to portray authority because articles is where people turn to get their news. There's trust there. News articles are supposed to be objective. They're supposed to be informative, but they're also somewhat bland and emotionless and almost apathetic. They show no personality by design. They're not supposed to have opinion or have any feelings. Meanwhile, the poem allows authors to convey their ideas emotively. They can show feelings. They can be creative. They can express opinion. So although both texts might address the same topic, in this case the economy, they tend to do so in very different ways, thus conveying different nuanced ideas about the topic, and they likely have different impacts on the audience. So that's an example of how you would look at structure, why one thing is chosen over another, and the impact it has on the overall message or the overall story or what have you. So to reiterate, CATS is an acronym that represents the 4 different aspects of a novel that you can analyze in order to create a strong answer to the paper 2 question. Context is the story itself. Author and purpose is who the writer is, what the message is, why he or she is conveying that message, and who they are trying to talk to. Tone and mood refer to the feelings of both the author and the audience, and style and structure is the way in which the story is being told, the tools that are being used to craft the story. So just remember, anytime you ever have to analyze any art, whether it's a book, a film, music, whatever it is, you can always call upon the analysis cats.
Analysis cats. Uh-oh, it's time for a dirty, filthy trick.
One trick you can use to show the reader that you're analyzing is to use phrases that refer to the author. For example, instead of saying Frankenstein is a symbol of human rage, you can say the author depicts Frankenstein as a symbol of human rage. Now, basically, they're both communicating the same thing, but in the latter, I'm talking about what the author is trying to do for the reader. So I'm talking about author's intention, which comes across as more analytical. Not just analyzing the text, but analyzing why the author did what they did and how it impacts the text. Another example, instead of saying the setting has an intimidating atmosphere, I can say the author's description of the setting creates an intimidating atmosphere. Again, same exact ideas, but I'm just presenting it in a way that demonstrates that I'm looking closely at what the author's doing, even though I'm basically saying the same thing in both sentences. So there you go. When you keep it focused on the author, you're keeping it focused on analysis. Let's talk about using quotes. Should I use them?
This is something students struggle with because they aren't sure if they need to memorize quotes or not. So first, let me tell you, as a grader, you do not need quotes to get a perfect score. If you write an awesome analysis, it's well organized, your vocab is impressive, and you answer the question in full, you can still get a great score without using quotes. I would argue the average student probably doesn't. However, you may find that using quotes can help you significantly with your evidence. And yeah, it certainly can. So what some students do is memorize a handful of quotes from each book, 5 to 10 depending on how good your memory is. And if you want to do that, you don't have to, but if you want to, when choosing a quote to remember, look for these 3 things.
The first thing you want to look for is simplicity. It should be something short and quick enough for you to remember. A bunch of paragraph-long quotes are going to be difficult to memorize. I mean, unless you have tremendous superhuman recall, your Captain Memory Stick or something.
Cut Captain
Boo!
Can
That guy
remember
sucks!
Long
I mean, sure, some people can do it, but a lot of people can't. So, if you don't have a flytrap memory where everything just sticks to your brain, then maybe pick simpler stuff to memorize. The next thing you want to look for is purpose. It should be a quote that has some depth to it so that you can at least use it to support your response. Memorizing a quote like, Mary went to the store, isn't likely going to help your arguments much. I mean, don't get me wrong. Everybody loves Mary, and everybody likes to know that she went to the store, but it's not going to do much for your essay. And the last thing you want to look for is flexibility. Your quote should be something that you can apply to various different types of questions. Something that shows symbolism, conflict, characterization, author's message. Lots of different things that you can use. For example, take a look at this quote from Fahrenheit 451. A book is a loaded gun in the house next door. Burn it! Take the shot from the weapon. Now this is short and the language is pretty simple, but it's clearly contributing a lot to the author's message. And it has flexibility. I can talk about the metaphor comparing the book to a gun. I can talk about the speaker's command to burn it and what that shows about the character. I can talk about the internal and external conflicts this sentence is connected to, burning the book versus not burning the book and what the implications are within that story. I can analyze the author's choice to use these words and create this dialogue. There's tons of stuff I can do with this quote. So I'd argue that this would be a viable quote to remember because you can likely use it for a bunch of different types of prompts. Now this is a quick chart that you can use to keep track of quotes. You can write the quote down, the page number, and a general analysis. Now what some students do when they want to work together is create a chart like this that everybody in class contributes to. So basically, it's something that your class or maybe your small group of friends are building together. That is called a shared workload. It's also called everybody chipping in to make life a little bit easier for everybody. It's a good thing because then you end up with a big sheet of quotes for each text that you've read, which makes it much easier when you're preparing for different kinds of prompts. This way, you don't have to go back into the books looking for quotes. You already have a sheet of quotes right there in front of you.
So to reiterate, do you need to remember quotes? No. You can paraphrase your overall ideas to support your argument. However, it certainly doesn't hurt, and they can help you develop your response if you have some that you can remember, as long as they're relevant. To make a comparison, imagine you were going to go camping, but you were worried about running into Bigfoot. It's a valid concern. I mean, who knows what that giant shoed beast might do? So to protect yourself, you bring a stun gun and bear mace and a hunting trap. Do you need all three? Probably not. The stun gun is probably more than enough. But if you have the bear mace, who knows, maybe it'll come in handy. So the same applies to memorizing quotes. What I'm trying to say is, quotes are bear mace. Do I need to explain myself more? I didn't think so.
Now that we've discussed analysis, let's talk about the actual exam itself. You will be given a paper with a few different prompts to choose from. You want to pick one that you can answer most easily. Remember, read the prompt thoroughly. Make sure you understand all aspects of the assignment. Essentially, there are two different approaches students take when it comes to this exam. Students either study several books in depth so that when they're given a prompt, they have a variety of books to choose from. If that's you, then you need to choose your prompt and then choose which texts you think will best fit that question. However, there are other students who basically just learn two books very well, which is more limiting, but might also be a bit easier than learning a whole bunch of books. So if that's you, then you need to choose the prompt that best fits your books. Either way, you need to choose a prompt and know which texts you're going to use. After you have that, it's time to create an outline. Now, some students don't like to create outlines, but it's strongly suggested you do. Why? Well, first, it shows that you're putting forth effort, which may impress some graders. It shouldn't have a direct bearing on your grade, but some graders do look for that because it often suggests how good the organization of your essay will be. But more so than that, it actually will help you organize your essay because it allows you to create a very clear map of what your ideas are and how you're going to establish them. It'll give you a road to walk. You'll know what your ideas are and how you're going to put them together into essay form. It'll keep you focused. Without an outline, students often let their ideas wander and they start rambling and going off topic. And that is not what you want. For each text, you should focus on 3 specific aspects to prove your point. Each aspect should be answering your prompt, and each aspect will get its own body paragraph. Let me give an example. Let's imagine you were asked to compare 2 cities. Now, this would obviously not be an IB question, but let's just use a simple question for illustration purposes. You decide the 2 cities you're going to compare. You choose New York and Paris. Okay, but there are tons of things you can talk about when comparing cities. You could write an entire book comparing New York and Paris, but we don't have that kind of time. So you need to focus on a few specific aspects. Which ones will you write about? So if I'm comparing New York and Paris, I might discuss the places to visit in each city, the food in each city, and the history of each city. And each of those topics will, of course, be explored in their own paragraph. Meaning that I would have 6 body paragraphs. Places to visit in New York, places to visit in Paris. Food in New York, food in Paris. History of New York, history of Paris. Add an introduction and a conclusion to that, and you have an 8-paragraph response. The 8-paragraph response is what you're aiming for. Now, let's look at an actual IB prompt and do the same thing. The prompt is, how do 2 of the works you have studied portray the struggle to be understood? So first, I'm going to choose my texts.
You better choose your books, buddy.
Now, there's lots of books you can choose to use for a prompt like this. I'm very tempted to pick Cat in the Hat, but I won't. It'll probably work against me. So instead, I'm going to pick Frankenstein by Mary Shelley and To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. The whole point of this prompt is to explore how these books show a struggle to be understood. So now I have to figure out what aspects of these books do I want to focus on that prove and demonstrate that these books show a struggle to be understood. So let's take a moment to understand what exactly this prompt wants from us. What is it truly asking? And let's do that by unpacking or clarifying the word how. When they're asking how in this prompt, what do they mean? It either means they want us to talk about the way the struggle is portrayed in the books. So in other words, what does it look like in each of the stories? Or it means with what techniques, in other words, what tools does the author use to show or create this struggle in the book? I am going to discuss what techniques the authors use to create the struggle and how these techniques present the struggle throughout the book. And in order to do that, the 3 aspects I've chosen are: number 1, I'm going to look at how the authors use internal and external conflicts in both stories to reflect this struggle to be understood. Second, I'm going to explore how both authors highlight the struggle to be understood with their use of characterization, specifically looking at the characters of Frankenstein's monster and Boo Radley. Both characters most certainly suffer with this struggle, the struggle to be understood. So they would be great choices to demonstrate how exactly this struggle is being depicted in the stories. And the third aspect I'm going to choose is to look at the reoccurring themes of loneliness and prejudice and how they emphasize the struggle in the stories. So now that I know what areas I am going to look at to discuss this prompt, all I got to do now is organize it. And how are we going to organize it? We're going to create an outline. Now, don't worry. It's going to be quick and simple. There are 2 ways to organize an essay, and you're going to pick which one you think is best for you. The first is called the point-by-point method, or some people call it the alternative method. This is where you address the first aspect of your first book, and then in the next paragraph, you address that same aspect for the other book. Then you address the second aspect for your first book, and then you address the second aspect for your second book. Then you address the third aspect for your first book, and then do the same for your second book. So clearly, you're alternating between books. You're going point by point, book by book. So for example, my first aspect is looking at how the authors use internal and external conflicts to show the struggle to be understood. So I'm going to talk about those conflicts in Frankenstein in my first body paragraph. Then I'm going to talk about those conflicts in To Kill a Mockingbird in my second paragraph. And then I'm going to move on to my next aspects. I'll talk about the characterization of Frankenstein in my third paragraph. And I'll talk about the characterization of To Kill a Mockingbird in my fourth paragraph, etc. So hopefully you see why they call it point by point, or the alternative method. They're quite creative, aren't they? But you don't have to do that one. There's another option called the block method. The block method is a little bit different. Now, the introduction and the conclusion will always be the same, regardless of whether you use a point-by-point method or a block method. The methods only refer to the body paragraphs. But by using the block method, instead of alternating between the books, you're going to address all 3 aspects of one book, and then you're going to address all 3 aspects of the next book, comparatively. You're essentially writing about the books in blocks. So for me, I would focus all on Frankenstein, and then I would focus all on To Kill a Mockingbird. Now, to be clear, neither is right and neither is wrong. Many people believe the alternative method is better because comparison is easier, going point by point and talking about both books at the same time, but it's really up to your own discretion. They're both right. Neither of them is wrong. The benefit of the point by point method is that you can address both books simultaneously, so it tends to flow a little bit better for the reader, especially since you can emphasize your points comparatively a lot better. So generally, this is the preferred method, but you do not need to do this one because the benefit of the block method is that you can focus on one book at a time, which can work perfectly fine. At the end of the day, the information remains the same. So this is only about how you're going to organize your ideas. As long as your organization is sensible and everything relates to your thesis, right? Everything is answering your prompt and each of your body paragraphs are talking about different aspects of that prompt without going off topic, then you should be fine. Then once you have this outline finished and you have a general map of what your essay will discuss and how it will be organized, well, then you're ready to write the introduction paragraph. Now, before we write the introduction, it's important to understand,
For some prompts, you need to write down a definition for the term you are discussing. Let me explain why. There are some words that have broad definitions, and to make an argument, you need to define what specific definition you want people to acknowledge for your answer. For example, you can define the word family as blood relatives. But if I give that definition, and then I turn around and say that my friend is my family, well, then by my own definition, he's not. So I'm a filthy liar. However, if I define family as anyone who you have close bonds with, well, at that point, he can very easily be part of my family. So if you get a question that explores a theme, for example, loyalty, love, success, you should write a definition for that term, and then prove that everything you're writing connects back to that definition.
first example, let's look at the prompt. In what ways are two of the works you've studied interested in the portrayal of psychological, physical, or some other kind of violence? So in this case, I would probably want to define violence. What is violence? Because I'm trying to prove that my books show violence. So in order for me to prove that they show violence, we have to clarify what exactly violence is. So let's say we define it as an aggressive attack from one person against another. All right, so let's say we read a book about a husband who shames his wife by not speaking to her when he feels that she has made a mistake, right? Gives her the silent treatment. By my definition, the one I gave, the silent treatment is not violence because it's not aggressive. It's actually quite passive. But let's say I want to argue that this is violence. Okay, well, if I want to make that argument, then I need to broaden my definition, right? So let's redefine it. Let's say violence is a purposeful action made by one person with the intent of hurting another. Now, if this is the definition that we're going to use, we can definitely argue that the silent treatment is a form of making her feel bad, which in turn I can argue is a form of violence. So you have to take the words that you're using and bend them to suit whatever your answer is going to be. Keep in mind, words are malleable. They're flexible. They have broad meanings and they have more specific meanings. But when you define your term, your definition still has to be honest. My two definitions of violence are legitimate interpretations of what violence is. We can all agree on that. I can't define violence as when two people sit down and have coffee together, because that's ridiculous. And it's wrong. If the prompt asks us to discuss when a character has regretted making a giant mistake, we can't define giant as small and insignificant. We're not reading from the Dictionary of Opposites or Dr. Seuss's Thesaurus of Nonsense. Our definition has to fit the word. They have to be real definitions of the term that people will accept. The goal of what we're doing is trying to identify which interpretation we're going with. Are we going to focus on something broad, or are we going to focus on something specific? Which one are we going to use when discussing the prompt? That's why when my first definition of violence was very specific, it didn't work for my story. But in the broader definition of violence, it worked perfectly fine. Defining your terms allows you tremendous control over the prompt as long as you stay true to the word you're defining. Now we're ready to write our introduction paragraph. Your introduction will have 4 parts: a setup, a thesis, the text reference, and the mapping statement. Now, some students think that they need to write this super elaborate 20-line introduction, but no, that's not what an introduction is used for. To illustrate how exactly to write this, we will continue using this prompt. How do two of the works you've studied portray the struggle to be understood? Again, we'll be using Frankenstein and To Kill a Mockingbird. Now, even if you've never read those books, it doesn't matter. You don't need to know the books. Just look at how the paragraph is being written and apply the same approach to your prompt and your choice of novels. So again, your introduction has 4 parts. Let's start with the setup. Normally, in a traditional introduction paragraph, this is where the hook would go. But for this essay, the setup is your hook. So basically, here's what you do. You write a general but brief response to the prompt. Then, if there are any terms that you need to define for your essay, you do it here. So for this prompt, here is my setup. The struggle to be understood is an experience people all around the world can relate to, given its universality. At its core, it is the pursuit of others to not only accept us, but to comprehend our perspectives. In other words, the reasons why we do what we do. First, I give a general comment about the prompt by saying that the struggle to be understood is something lots of people can relate to. I'm acknowledging the prompt. Then, I define the term exactly as we discussed. What is the struggle to be understood? Well, for the purposes of this essay, it's the pursuit of others to not only accept us, but to comprehend our perspectives, in other words, the reasons why we do what we do. I have now clarified what the struggle to be understood means in this paper. The struggle to be understood could literally mean when people don't understand what you're saying, like two people speaking different languages. But that's not the definition that's going to help me, because that is not what my books are about. My books are about people who are misunderstood by society. So, the definition I've given is the one that suits me best. And there you go. This is my setup. Next, you write your thesis statement. Thesis statement is just a fancy term for your main idea, what you're trying to prove. I write my thesis here. This endeavor is exemplified with literary devices in 2 texts in particular. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, a Gothic fiction novel first published in 1818, and Harper Lee's thriller To Kill a Mockingbird, first published in 1960. Basically, my argument is that the 2 authors use various devices to portray the struggle to be understood in both books. So let's remember, what is the prompt asking? It's asking us to talk about how the struggle is portrayed. Well, it's portrayed by using literary devices. Literary devices is a general term that refers to all the types of tools authors use for writing. So, I've answered the prompt, and now this is what I have to prove. This is the whole point of my essay. Now, the thesis should, in one sentence, capture your overall main argument. Your thesis is going to control your entire essay. Control. It's the pilot, the coach, the guideline. Everything you talk about must connect to the thesis, because your thesis connects to the prompt. If there is something that doesn't connect, it does not belong in your essay. Get it out of there. Think of your thesis as if it's a blueberry pie. Now, what goes into a blueberry pie? Blueberries? Yes. Sugar? Sure. Pie? I guess. Onions? No. No, they don't. Doesn't belong. So, same with your essay. Your thesis is the recipe. If something doesn't connect, then it doesn't belong. Take the onions out of the blueberry pie. Believe that. Then we make sure we identify the text we're going to use. I already did this in my thesis statement. Now, some people like to identify the books in a separate sentence. You can name the texts before your thesis if you want. You can name it after your thesis. It really doesn't matter. As long as the reader knows what you are arguing, which is your thesis, and what text you will use to support your argument, you should be fine. Now, when you write the texts, you should probably mention the authors, and maybe even throw in the publication dates and the genres as well, if you know them. You can see that's what I did. Now, to be clear, you do not need the publication date or even the genre, especially if your prompt isn't focused on that sort of information. Our prompt isn't asking so much about genre or historical context, so the information isn't super necessary, but I included it anyway. But at the very least, you should definitely include the author's names, if nothing else. And then finally, we write the mapping statement. The mapping statement identifies the aspects or the areas you will focus on, the areas you're going to analyze to prove your thesis. Basically, these are the reasons why your thesis is right. You're simply going to mention them here. No details, just introduce to the reader what you're going to use to prove your thesis. So, as you may remember, I chose to focus on conflict, characterization, and theme. These are the three tools that I think the authors used to portray the struggle to be understood. So now, I simply write them into my introduction as a mapping statement. Both Shelley and Lee use internal and external conflict, the characterization of social outcasts, and the themes of loneliness and prejudice to demonstrate the hurdles one must confront when pursuing understanding and acceptance. Now, in this case, the hurdles one must confront when pursuing understanding and acceptance is just another way to say struggle to be understood. I'm just elaborating on it a bit further to avoid repeating the same words over and over again. But even if you wrote something simpler, like both Shelley and Lee use internal and external conflicts, the characterization of social outcasts, and the themes of loneliness and prejudice to demonstrate the struggle to be understood, that would be perfectly fine. That is still a fully functional mapping statement. You may notice that I do try to throw in a couple of big words just to boost my vocabulary, but at the end of the day, you don't need advanced vocabulary to do well on the exam. So you can express your ideas in simpler language. Don't be intimidated by the word choice. Now, if we put this all together, we have our introduction paragraph. The struggle to be understood is an experience people all around the world can relate to, given its universality. At its core, it is the pursuit of others to not only accept us, but to comprehend our perspectives. In other words, the reasons why we do what we do. This is a conflict that defies borders, genders, or even time periods. Thus, why it makes for such a viable theme within literature. This endeavor is exemplified with literary devices in two texts in particular. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, a Gothic fiction novel first published in 1818, and Harper Lee's thriller To Kill a Mockingbird, first published in 1960. Both Shelley and Lee use conflict, the characterization of social outcasts, and the themes of loneliness and prejudice to demonstrate the hurdles one must confront when pursuing understanding and acceptance. So to quickly review, first I comment on the question. This is my setup or my hook. I'm just commenting on the central theme of the question. Next, I'm going to define any important terms. In this case, I'm going to define what the struggle to be understood actually means. Now, in this sentence, the reason I use parentheses is because I want to make sure my meaning isn't lost in big words. I want to be clear about what I'm talking about. But remember, big words aren't necessary. So I can very easily just turn this sentence into, at its core, it's the pursuit of others to not only accept us, but to understand the reasons why we do what we do. It's not going to hurt your grade if you keep it simpler. Now, I added these lines as part of the setup just because I feel like they add a bit more context and commentary. They help the flow a bit, since they do strengthen the bridge between the setup and the thesis. But for the sake of functionality and just keeping it simple, you don't really need them. The paragraph works perfectly fine without them. So, I make sure I have a clear thesis that directly responds to my prompt. And I end by pointing out to the reader which aspects or areas I'm going to focus on to prove my thesis. That's my mapping statement. So, there you go. This is a viable introduction. The thesis is clear. The reader knows what tools or what areas I'm going to focus on. The reader knows what books I'm talking about. We should be good to go. Now, we have our outline and we have our introduction. So, we're just about ready to write our body paragraphs. But first, let's just quickly discuss the importance of using comparative language.
Now, before we start writing paragraphs, you need to keep in mind that your job is to discuss the two novels in relation to the prompt. So, to do that, you need to use comparative language. In other words, you want to use language that shows comparison and contrast. So first off, be aware of comparatives and superlatives.
Comparative adjectives typically end in ER, and they're normally followed by the word than. Yep, that's right. They are comparative adjectives because they compare. Wherever did they get that name from? A superlative adjective is also a comparative word, but it is used to refer to the highest degree of something. To keep it simple, comparative ends with ER, superlative ends with EST, right? It is the most of something, the smartest, the prettiest, the tallest. Faster is comparative, fastest is superlative.
Now, most people know how to use comparatives and superlatives, so that's not a problem. But in addition, you also have to use comparative transitional phrases, which are used to connect ideas together. So here are a whole bunch of comparative language that you should start using and getting comfortable with, not just for the exam, but for any time you want to write or speak comparatively.
We don't need to cover this because it's pretty self-explanatory, but the list of comparative language is included with the class as a download, so refer to it, use it as best you can.
Essentially, you will use this comparative language whenever you're referring to either similarities or contrasts between the two texts. Seems simple, but some students don't use it, which hurts their score. Transitions are considered part of effective writing, so to pull in the highest number, you gotta use them.
Alright, so now that we have the introduction, it's time to build the body paragraphs. To do that, we have to use the peel method.
Peel method.
Because you will likely aim to write about 3 aspects of each book, and again, you should aim to write 6 body paragraphs total, 3 on each book. Each paragraph is going to focus on one aspect of your mapping statement in regards to one book. Again, you don't need to fit every idea you have into your essay, just focus on the 3 areas you've chosen. Make sure that they connect to your thesis and stay focused. Remember, your thesis matters most. So you might ask, well, what is the peel method? Simple. To write a body paragraph, this is the approach you should take. Peel stands for point, evidence, analysis, and link. Point refers to your overall main idea of the paragraph, right? This is going to be your topic sentence. It makes it very clear to the reader what this paragraph will be about and how it connects to your thesis. That's why they call it a point. It's the point you're making in your paragraph. Next is your evidence. This is your proof. What can you use from the book to prove your point, right? Whatever your topic sentence is claiming. So this might be a quotation or a description or some sort of event that happens in the book that you're going to use to demonstrate the point. Next, you have the analysis. Analysis is where you use your words to emphasize the evidence and show the reader how your evidence proves your point. You're going to make it clear to your reader. The evidence is where you write down what happened, and the analysis is explaining how it proves your point. If you would like to replace the idea of analysis with the word explain, that's fine because it still spells peel. So you can prefer peel with an A or peel with an E, but it's basically the same thing, whichever you like. And then finally, we have the link. Link just means that you should connect your idea either back to your thesis or to your next idea. This is simply used for emphasis and flow. So let me show an example of this in play. Let's say this is my thesis. Florida is a terrible place to visit on vacation. Okay, so that's my thesis. I want to explore that idea. And to do that, I'm going to focus on 3 aspects. I'm going to talk about the alligators, I'm going to talk about the weather, and I'm going to talk about the dim-witted bank robbers that fill the state. Let's just focus on body paragraph number 1, which is going to be the alligators. I'm going to start with my point. First and foremost, the entire state of Florida is overrun by man-eating alligators. Okay, so there we go. That's the first aspect, right? I've now introduced it. I've made it the clear point of this paragraph. As stated in the Miami Herald, recent studies have shown a 500% increase in alligators all across the state since 2017, which has resulted in over 420 alligator-related deaths. This is the evidence. In this case, I'm taking it from a newspaper, but if I was using a book, I would simply take something from the book that proves my point. It's my evidence, right? I can't make a claim without some sort of proof. Next, having this many alligators on the loose is clearly a public danger, and statistics suggest the alligator problem is only getting worse. Okay, so this is my analysis or my explanation. I'm taking my evidence, I'm clarifying it, I'm unpacking it, I'm looking closely at it, and I'm making it clear to the reader why it's proving my point. And then finally, the average Florida tourist looks forward to warm beaches and tasty brunches, but at this rate, they may wind up on a warm beach as a tasty brunch for some alligator, which emphasizes a significant reason why Florida is not a great place to visit right now. So I link back to my thesis, right? What's my thesis? I'm arguing that Florida is not a great place for tourists. Now, I don't want you to think just because there are 4 aspects of the peel method that you only need 4 sentences. I know my example only has 4 sentences, but the point is, for the IB prompt, you're probably going to need many sentences to tackle those. Not to mention the fact that you may have multiple pieces of evidence and multiple analyses or explanations. So my example is just for illustrative purposes. It's a sample, but of course, you're going to make yours much better than mine. So here we have an example of a complete body paragraph. It's a bit long, so get yourself a pillow in case you fall asleep in the middle. To start with, in To Kill a Mockingbird, Harper Lee depicts the character of Boo Radley as someone who suffers from the unfair judgment, or more so misjudgment, of residents in his town. most of whom draw conclusions about him without proper context. As it states in the text, Boo dined on raw squirrels and any cats he would catch. His hands were blood-stained, with a long, jagged scar that ran across his face. What teeth he had were yellow and rotten. His eyes popped, and he drooled most of the time. This all shows that he is presented as a gruesome monster with a focus on his dreadful, intimidating appearance and his animalistic, uncivilized behavior. The author uses this description to demonstrate how he is spoken about in town as an uncivilized, distasteful villain to be feared, which places the reader in the position of similar, biased townfolk. When the reader first encounters this description, he or she also likely imagines a depraved creature that should be avoided. However, by the end of the novel, it becomes clear that this description is not only exaggerated, but clearly one-sided, which goes to show how misunderstood he truly is. Lee allows for the reader to slowly discover this by keeping Boo a mystery throughout most of the novel. So, to the reader, Boo is no different than he is to most of the townspeople. He is a rumor, someone the reader has heard about, but who has not been formally introduced. So, if the reader's initial impression is that Boo is a dangerous, frothy-mouthed villain, then it emphasizes how easy it is to pass judgment on those who we do not actually know. Furthermore, although Boo is aware of how he is viewed by the public, Lee makes it clear that he is not fully equipped with the skill or the social capacity to advocate for himself in the struggle against this unfair misrepresentation, which in itself emphasizes how easy it is for such a misunderstanding, to put it mildly, can linger when it remains unchecked. And if you take time to read it, you'll see that the topic sentence introduces the aspect that I'll be focusing on, talking about how characterization is used to portray the struggle to be understood. Thus, it clearly connects back to the thesis, which of course connects to the prompt. Then, these lines are my evidence, discussing how the townspeople misjudge him, and the problems that it creates for the character of Boo Radley, again emphasizing a struggle to be understood. This clearly connects to the topic sentence, which again connects to the thesis, which again connects to the prompt. Then here we analyze how this evidence supports the thesis, and elaborates on the concepts, exploring how Boo portrays that struggle to be understood. This also connects back to the topic sentence, and subsequently to the prompt. And then we directly link back to the thesis to wrap up the paragraph. Or you can just as easily link to the next paragraph, just as long as everything still connects to the thesis overall, which of course is the point, because that links back to the prompt. So, by following the Peel method, A or E, whichever you prefer, for each of your body paragraphs, you should be able to ensure that you are staying focused, including evidence, and analyzing that evidence in a way that proves your thesis and makes that clear to the reader, which of course is your grader. And if you do that, your essay should be pretty strong, which means that your grade should be pretty strong too. Which brings me to a word I want to make about vocabulary. Now remember, when it comes to formal essay writing, you get graded for two things: what you're saying and how you're saying it. So you could have a great answer, but lose out on points if you don't have enough style or if your words are very repetitive. So, in order to try to get more style points, you want to try to diversify your language. Now, if you can avoid it, try not to let your sentences all look the same. You want them to look somewhat unique, a little bit different from each other. I mean, technically, you could write something super simple like this. One way Mary Shelley portrays the struggle to be understood is using symbolism. Harper Lee also uses symbolism to explore the struggle to be understood. Mary Shelley also uses characterization to portray the struggle to be understood. Harper Lee uses characterization to portray the struggle to be understood too. It's not wrong, but it's not considered best of the best writing. Why? What's wrong with them? Nothing. They're functional. They work. But the issue is that you're essentially just repeating the same words over and over again. Portray the struggle to be understood. So, although that works, it conveys the idea that you want. The issue is that your word choice is very repetitive. So you're essentially just copying the same topic sentence over and over again, just changing a few words. Again, that works. It's perfectly fine. But you're going to lose out on some points for being repetitive and not showing a diverse enough vocabulary. So you might be better off using some synonyms, or changing around the structure of your sentences a bit just to show some variety. That would get you more points on the rubric in terms of style and word choice. So again, remember, there's two aspects to this test. There's what you say and there's how you say it. What you say matters most. If what you say is really good, then you should pass the test. If what you say is really good and you say it in a great way, you should ace the test. And that's the difference. If your answer makes no sense, but you say it in a beautiful way, you will not do well on the test. But you'll get some bonus points for having great language. So your answer and your organization matter most, but vocab will definitely put you over the top in terms of getting the highest of all scores.
So allow me to reiterate everything one last time. When you're writing, you always have to keep in mind who your audience is. I'll give an example.
I'm going to tell you the difference between writing for academic and writing for business. You ready for this? If you've never studied business, you're going to learn something about business here. For business, if you're writing an advertisement, for example, you want very simple sentences, elementary level vocabulary. Why? Because you want to reach as many people as possible. You don't want them to think too much. You typically want to connect to their emotions in some way. And you want to keep things simple. But when you're writing for academia, it's the exact opposite. Because the nerd patrol is out looking for word parties, and you got to give them one. Now, that doesn't mean you need to be overly verbose, but you do need to entice these readers. And one way you can do it is to use advanced vocabulary if you can. If you can't, then don't. Just have great ideas. Great ideas is enough to pass this test with a strong grade if your organization is tight and your language is at least clear. All right? Don't start using nonsense words that you don't know because that could hurt you. But if you can handle using some advanced vocab, if you have it in you, then this is the time to bring it out. Try not to rely too much on the same word choice. Use synonyms. Say things in different ways. Think of it like a dance. Now, if you know one dance, the same old two-step, can you get by on a dance floor? Absolutely, as long as you apply it well. But if you know multiple dance moves, then all the better. You're going to be a star on the dance floor. But if you think you might know more dance moves, and it turns out you're not dancing, but you're doing jumping jacks under a disco ball, then you have made an error, and you're not going to get good points for dancing. That is my analogy for using vocabulary. If you got it, use it. But if you're not sure you got it, stick to what you know best. Keep it to the same old two-step. It's still better than doing jumping jacks in the middle of a dance floor. As always, if you can make it sound flowery, great. Use different sentence structures, use different words, use synonyms, use adjectives to dress it all up. That's great. But only do that if you can. If you can't, focus on having a great answer and tight organization. All right, we're almost done. We're down to the wire. All we have left is to write the conclusion paragraph. And the conclusion paragraph is actually going to mirror the introduction paragraph in many ways. So for your conclusion, first, you simply restate your thesis. So basically, you're going to say the same idea, but you're going to use different words. You have to vary your language somewhat. So don't copy the sentence, but reiterate the idea with different language. Then restate your main arguments. So in other words, you're essentially restating your mapping statement. Again, use different words and different sentence structure, but maintain the overall idea. And then end with a final statement. What should your final statement be? This could be the overall lesson or the concluding idea that you feel the reader should have learned by reading your essay. You're going to end with a culminating idea that is interesting and that makes the reader think. Do not introduce any new ideas. If you haven't spoken about the idea already in your essay by now, you are not going to bring it up in your conclusion. The conclusion is no place for extra ideas. You've said what you need to say. The conclusion is your thoughtful goodbye to the reader. So if you look at this conclusion and how it connects to the introduction, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. First sentence.
All in all, both Shelley and Harper used their texts to explore humans' inevitable struggle to be understood.
Again, this is basically my thesis, but I'm saying it in different words.
Through the use of conflict, character development, and thematic hypotheses, the authors reflect communal experience of being misjudged, misinterpreted, or misconstrued, accurately presenting a challenge so many people encounter in life.
Again, reiterating the same idea here, just using different words. Though both of these novels tell compelling stories, it is their message about how we all long to be accepted that makes them not just amazing tales, but all-time classics. That's my culminating idea. That's my overall assessment. This is my parting goodbye to the reader. That's my clincher. The last sentence is what brings it all together. And there you go. That is how you write a conclusion. It's pretty simple. Restate your ideas and tie it together with a conclusion sentence. Nothing more, nothing less, and you should be fine. As we mentioned earlier, you have to be able to bend the books that you've chosen to suit the prompt you want to answer. I mean, you want to choose 2 books that are malleable or flexible enough to address multiple different types of prompts. So practicing that before the test can actually be quite useful. Now, IB is always thinking up new questions, but if you survey the types of prompts they've given in the past, most of them will come down to some variation of these 10 ideas. I'm quite confident if you can bend your books to address these topics, you should be ready for whatever prompts the test gives you. So let's call this the Timeless 10. Or we could just call these the 10 to bend, baby! Either way, let's take a look at what they are. Now, you may receive a prompt that focuses on achievement or success and failure, which could also manifest as a power question, something that focuses on strength or weakness. I mean, you can even argue that success is a type of strength. So think about how your books relate to the ideas of strength and weakness, success and failure. That could be physical power, that could be social power, that could be status, wealth, the ability to do certain things. Most stories have characters that succeed or fail at things. And most characters have a strength of some sort, and of course, their flaws could be explored as weaknesses, or failures of character, or development, or whatever. So this is one type of prompt you may see. Another focuses on justice and morality, righteousness, the rules of good versus bad. This essentially deals with the ideas of right and wrong, but it also deals with the idea of who determines what is right and what is wrong. So the first thing you need to keep in mind is that there's a cultural morality, right? What society thinks is right. And then there's the individual's morality, what each of us as people think is right. Consider how these ideas are explored in your books. When answering a question like this, focus on what is expected by society, what is expected by individual characters, and how are these expectations being challenged within the text. Then, on a more meta level, you can ask yourself how the author is perhaps using the story itself to question the concepts of morality or justice. Maybe the author is trying to make a point. For example, a lot of feminist novels did this when they advocated for female equality during times when equality was lacking. So, think about how the ideas of right and wrong are explored or challenged within the story. The third topic deals with some sort of conflict. Now, this could be a focus on tension, it could be a focus on oppression, it could be a focus on violence or discrimination. Keep in mind that conflict doesn't always need to be between people. You could be overcoming an illness. You could be fighting a bear. You could have a conflict against society, right? Challenging social norms and expectations. You could have a conflict with yourself when you're struggling to better yourself, for example. So this type of question wants you to explore what the issues are, why they exist, who's causing it, what do they want from the conflict, and how does power play a role in the whole thing. So keep those considerations in mind. And as always, look at the story in terms of symbolism. The story that you're reading could be a representation of a much bigger idea with a much larger message. The next type of prompt could ask you to analyze the use of certain literary devices. For example, it may ask you to talk about how metaphor is used, or how symbolism is used, or how the setting plays a role in the story. These types of questions usually want you to focus on the literary techniques or devices that the author uses, and how they're being used, why the author chose them. So think about them as tools. What do they accomplish? What impact did they have? Why are they in the story to begin with? And how do they impact the story overall? The next type of prompt could be about culture. Now, culture deals a lot with time and location. Now, this could manifest as a question about history, about mythology, about perspective. It essentially explores the thoughts, the expectations, the customs, and the behaviors of a particular time and place. Now, the context is key here. These types of questions are why you have to know who wrote the story, where they came from, how their backgrounds impacted the story, and what they're trying to say with their novel. The IB is big on pushing international texts. Just make sure that you understand the text on a cultural level. Understand how it compares to modern society, how it compares to your own culture, what culture it comes from, what it's trying to say about that culture, know the perspectives of that time and that place, and look at how either those perspectives have changed or how the author is perhaps trying to challenge those perspectives. The next type of prompt asks you to analyze the text itself. So it's going to ask you to look at the context, the structure, the narrator, the style, the genre the story's in. These types of questions can be a bit more challenging to answer because you have to analyze not the story itself as much as the way that it's presented. Why did the author use this type of text? The novella, the short story, a play or poem. Why did they choose that? Why did the author structure it the way that they did? Why did they end the story the way they did? Why did they present their ideas the way they did? What kind of narration did they choose? Why did they do that? How does it impact the story? Why did the author choose the genre they chose? Here, you're essentially deconstructing the author's work itself and analyzing the choices the author made and understanding how it impacts the overall story and the message the story delivers. The next type of prompt will explore the idea of class or race or gender or age or some other demographic like that. This is pretty self-explanatory. These types of questions ask you to analyze the role that race, gender, age, class play within the world, within the setting of the story, within the characters' lives, and within the characters' interactions. Often this connects with power in some way, as usually there's a group with power and those without power. This is usually exploring the concept of the haves versus the have-nots. It explores the idea of how the power structure affects society. It asks how fair it is, it asks how the power can be shifted, if it can be at all, and how it came to be. The next type of prompt looks at relationships. This could be family relationships, friendships, it could deal with love, it could deal with hate, it could deal with resentment. This is simply analyzing personal connections. Why we connect with each other, why we don't connect with each other, how do we take advantage of each other, what true friendship is, what true love is, what these relationships say about human nature, what they show about society, how are the relationships being demonstrated, where do they stem from, what is the author's overall message? I mean, you get it. The next type of prompt can explore the idea of communication. This could be through the idea of understandings, it could be through the idea of misunderstandings, it could be through the idea of cultural differences. This can explore how people interact with each other, how they connect with each other, how they fail to connect with each other, how texts communicate ideas to people, how they communicate ideas to future generations or to other cultures, how ideas can be interpreted different ways based on context or perspective. I mean, this type of question essentially asks you to analyze what is being said, why is it being said, who is saying it, and of course, what is the overall purpose. The next type of question explores some sort of theme. It could be loyalty, friendship, love, hate, resentment, happiness, pride, disappointment. These types of questions ask you to discuss a specific concept within the text. You could find many different types of themes within any text, even those that may not be obvious at first. So practice with different types of themes. Can you think about how loyalty may be presented in your books? Can you think about how disappointment or pride or love are relevant in those stories? More times than not, you can find some sort of connection to most themes, but how strong the connection is will depend on the text and, to a certain extent, a mix of your own creativity and analytical abilities. And finally, we have prompts about realism, relatability, and or surrealism. For these type of prompts, you can basically look at how the story is relatable or not relatable. Most stories the IB chooses are intended to be relatable, even if they're wacky sci-fi stuff. There is usually something relatable in the story. The author either creates a sense of realism for the reader through techniques like characterization or plot development, or they create a sense of realism through relatability, by showing universal themes or common traits. For example, Batman. Batman is a guy that runs around in a batsuit. Nobody can relate to that itself. But people can relate to the ideas of vengeance and loneliness and justice, and those things are what drive the Batman character. So although Batman in itself is ridiculous, the story is actually quite relatable. So find the concepts within the story that are reflected in real life, if the question's about realism or relatability, or if it's asking about surrealism, look at the real life ideas in the story that are being exaggerated and ask yourself, why are they being exaggerated? Also, keep in mind that a lot of these prompt ideas can all connect with each other. So a question may ask about family, but family can extend to the idea of community. It can extend to the idea of friendship. It can even extend to the concept of love and belonging. So if you get a prompt about friendship and you didn't prepare an answer for friendship, but you do have an answer about community or about love or about human connection, essentially you can take those answers, tweak them a bit, and apply it to the concept of family because it's all going to be relatively similar. And also keep in mind that the themes or ideas prompts ask you about can also relate to their inverse or their opposite. So if you're asked about family, you can also usually speak about the lack of family or the lack of community and how that connects to the prompt. as long as you phrase it in a way that relates specifically to what the prompt is asking. Now, there's tons of different themes that could all be related to each other, but here's an example of a few. You could connect the idea of perseverance to the idea of bravery to the idea of courage, and on the inverse, you can connect it to the idea of meekness and fear and cowardice. You can find connections between these ideas. So the point is, be flexible. Find connections. And if you could take the books and apply it to the 10 ideas we just talked about, and you can remain flexible, then you should be 1000% ready to take on these prompts, and you should be able to answer whatever they put in front of you.
All right, now you should be ready to rock that paper too, baby. Just remember, know at least 2 books very well. Know how to bend those books to answer a bunch of different types of questions. Be able to organize your ideas in a sensible way. Use analysis to explore the prompt and explain your ideas, but do not summarize. And make sure you stay on topic. The prompt is your king. Your thesis is your queen. Keep them married, and everything else bows to that king and queen. And if you do that, you should do all right for yourself. Now, at this point, I would wish you good luck, but I don't think you're going to need it. So instead, I'll say, go and show them what you got.